Welcome, dear listener, to this calming exploration of history designed to help you unwind and drift off to a peaceful slumber. Before we begin our story, I'd love to know where in the world you're joining us from and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and say hello. And if you enjoy relaxing tales of times gone by, I invite you to subscribe for more soothing stories like this. Now make yourself comfortable, take a deep breath, and let your mind wander back to a bygone era known as the Renaissance. Spanning the 14th to 17th centuries, this period is often romanticized as a golden age of art, culture, and progress that brought Europe out of the Middle Ages and into the modern world. Names like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Shakespeare conjure images of soaring creativity and enlightened thinking. But what was life really like for the average person during this much exalted epoch? Behind the glittering facade of the Renaissance, the stark reality for most was an existence that was nasty, brutish and short, to borrow the famous words of philosopher Thomas Hobbes. While a privileged few patronized the fine arts and pondered the mysteries of science, the vast majority toiled in wretched squalor, facing threats ranging from deadly plagues to religious persecution to the constant spectre of war. In this episode, we'll peek behind the curtain of history and examine the darker, dirtier, and more dangerous aspects of Renaissance life that are too often airbrushed out of the picture. We'll see that the remarkable cultural and intellectual achievements of this period were in many ways made possible by the thankless sacrifices of the countless commoners whose names have been lost to history. So get settled in as we embark on an unflinching journey into an age that, for all its wonders, could also be a living nightmare. Imagine yourself walking down a narrow, crooked street in Renaissance London. The year is 1590, and you are a common labourer living in the teeming tenements of the city's poorer quarters. As you step out your door, the first thing that hits you is the stench. There is no sewage system, so chamber pots are simply emptied out of windows into the gutters below. Animal dung, rotting garbage, and even human corpses are left to fester in the streets. Rats and flies spread disease unimpeded, and potable water is scarce. As you begin your long workday, you pass by the scenes of wretchedness that are commonplace in your neighbourhood. Beggars with open sores and missing limbs plead for alms, while orphaned children with bloated bellies wail from hunger. You avert your eyes and hurry along, knowing that their fate could easily be your own if injury or illness prevented you from earning your daily bread. For the poor, there is no social safety net, and even a minor misfortune can lead to utter destitution. Your destination is one of the many construction sites where London's rapid growth is being carried out on the backs of men like you. The hours are long, the labour is backbreaking, and the pay is a pittance. Hauling heavy loads of bricks and mortar, you feel a twinge in your abdomen and realise that you're developing a hernia from the constant strain. You know that if it worsens, you could be incapacitated and cast out on the street with no means of support. As the sun rises higher, the heat becomes oppressive, and you long for a drink of clean water. But the well has run dry, and the only liquid at hand is the foul, greenish ale provided by your employer. You have no choice but to gulp it down and try to ignore the burning in your gut. Dysentery is rife in the city, and you've seen scores of your fellow workers fall ill with the bloody flux. If the contagion takes hold of you, your only recourse will be the quackery of the barber surgeons, whose favourite cure is to drain your excess humours with primitive bloodletting. Finally, the sun begins to set, and your long day of toil comes to an end. As you wearily make your way home, you pass the towering facade of St. Paul's Cathedral, where the great architect Inigo Jones is overseeing a grand renovation. For a moment you marvel at its beauty, but then reality sets in. you know that a single carved stone in that edifice costs more than you'll earn in a lifetime, and that its splendor is not meant for the likes of you. At last, you come to your squalid lodgings and collapse onto your flea-ridden straw mattress. The room is packed with other laborers and their families, and the close quarters are a breeding ground for disease. As you drift off to a fitful sleep, you say a silent prayer that you'll be spared the ravages of the pox or the plague for one more day. It's a prayer that has become all too routine. Such was the lot of the common man in Renaissance England, and indeed throughout much of Europe in this turbulent age. While the extraordinary achievements of the era's luminaries may have laid the groundwork for a brighter future, that future was still centuries away for the multitudes mired in misery. Nowhere was the vast gulf between the haves and have-nots more apparent than in the opulent palace of the Medici family in Florence. The Medicis were the quintessential Renaissance dynasty, rising from humble origins as textile merchants to become the wealthiest and most powerful clan in Europe through a combination of a business savvy, political cunning, and sheer ruthlessness. They turned Florence into the cultural capital of the continent and themselves into living legends. But the true source of the Medici's fabulous riches was not their patronage of the arts or their mastery of statecraft. It was quite simply the exploitation of the masses. The family's fortune was built on the back of the Florentine wool trade, which employed thousands of low-paid workers in crowded, dangerous factories. The Medicis also profited handsomely from the high taxes and rents they extracted from the city's impoverished underclass. While the likes of Cosimo and Lorenzo de' Medici basked in the splendor of their villas and gardens, adorning themselves with silks and jewels, and surrounding themselves with the greatest artists and thinkers of the age, the average Florentine struggled just to keep a roof over their head and food on the table. The lavish banquets and balls thrown by the Medicis, where guests dined on exotic delicacies and danced to the music of world-class orchestras, stood in stark contrast to the meagre rations and grinding labour that were the lot of the common folk. One telling example of the Medici's excess came in 1471, when Lorenzo the Magnificent held a jousting tournament to celebrate his marriage. The event was a dazzling spectacle of wealth and pageantry, with richly caparisoned horses, glittering armour, and a who's who of Italian nobility in attendance. But the real jaw-dropper was the prize Lorenzo offered to the winner, a statue of Mars crafted by none other than Andrea del Verrocchio, the master sculptor who had trained the young Leonardo da Vinci. The fact that Lorenzo could so casually give away a priceless work of art as a tournament trinket speaks volumes about the vast chasm between the Renaissance elite and everyone else. For the Medicis and their ilk, art was little more than a status symbol, a way to flaunt their wealth and sophistication. But for the artisans and craftsmen who actually created these masterpieces, art was a means of putting food on the table. The idea that a sculpture they had poured their heart and soul into could be so blithely discarded by a bored aristocrat must have been galling. But the Medici's callousness towards the lower classes extended far beyond their artistic pretensions. In 1478, the family was targeted by the Pazzi conspiracy, a plot by rival bankers to assassinate Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano. The conspirators struck during Easter Mass at the cathedral, stabbing Giuliano to death, but only wounding Lorenzo. In the aftermath, the enraged Medicis unleashed a reign of terror on the city, executing or exiling hundreds of their enemies and consolidating their grip on power. For the average Florentine, caught in the crossfire of this vicious feud, the message was clear. In the cutthroat world of Renaissance politics, their lives were utterly expendable. The great game of power played by the Medicis and their rivals was a deadly serious business, and woe betide anyone who got in the way. So while we may marvel at the artistic and intellectual ferment of Renaissance Florence, it's important to remember that this golden age was built on a foundation of exploitation and indifference to human suffering. The soaring beauty of the Duomo and the Palazzo Vecchio, the breathtaking canvases of Botticelli and Michelangelo, the revolutionary ideas of Galileo and Machiavelli, all of these wonders were made possible by the backbreaking labour and destitution of the faceless masses. As we continue our journey through the dark underbelly of the Renaissance, we turn our attention to one of the most feared and reviled groups of the era, the mercenaries. These professional soldiers of fortune were a ubiquitous presence in the patchwork of city-states and principalities that made up Italy and much of Europe, offering their services to the highest bidder and switching sides at the drop of a hat. For the rulers and elites who employed them, mercenaries were a necessary evil, a way to project power and defend their interests without the expense and hassle of maintaining a standing army. But for the common people, mercenaries were a scourge, a horde of heavily armed thugs who roamed the countryside, pillaging and plundering at will. One of the most notorious mercenary captains of the Renaissance was a man named Francesco Busone da Carmagnola. Born into poverty in the Piedmont region of Italy, Carmagnola rose through the ranks of the condottieri, mercenary companies, by dint of his cunning and brutality. He fought for a succession of masters, including the Visconti Dukes of Milan and the Republic of Venice, amassing a huge fortune along the way. But Carmagnola's loyalty was always for sale to the highest bidder, and in 1426 he betrayed his Venetian employers by defecting to their enemy, the Duke of Milan. For the next 5 years, he led Milanese armies in a series of devastating raids on Venetian territory, burning crops, looting villages, and leaving a trail of misery in his wake. The impact of Carmagnola's depredations on the ordinary people caught in the middle was incalculable. Farmers saw their livelihoods go up in smoke as their fields were torched and their livestock slaughtered. Artisans and labourers were press-ganged into building fortifications and supplying the mercenary horde. Women and children were subjected to unspeakable atrocities at the hands of the rampaging soldiers. And yet, despite the havoc he wreaked, Carmagnola was hailed as a hero by the Milanese, who showered him with honours and wealth. His treachery against Venice was seen as a masterstroke of realpolitik, a triumph of Machiavellian cunning over naive idealism. It was a stark reminder that, in the dog-eat-dog world of Renaissance Italy, might made right and the ends always justified the means. But Carmagnola's luck finally ran out in 1432, when he again switched sides and led a Venetian army against his former Milanese masters. This time, however, he was outfoxed and outfought by the Duke of Milan's generals, and his army was routed. Carmagnola himself was captured and hauled back to Venice in chains. There, in a show trial that was a mockery of justice, he was convicted of treason and sentenced to death. On May 5th, 1432, he was led out into the Piazza San Marco, where a huge crowd had gathered to witness his execution. With a single stroke of the executioner's blade, the once mighty Carmagnola was beheaded, his blood staining the stones of the piazza. For the Venetians, Carmagnola's fate was a warning to all who would betray the Republic. But for the average citizen, it was just another reminder of the precariousness of life in an age when violence and treachery were the order of the day. The mercenaries might be gone, but the scars they left on the land and its people would endure for generations. As we've seen, the Renaissance was a time of stark contrasts, when the heights of human achievement coexisted with the depths of human cruelty. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the treatment of women and minorities, who faced oppression and persecution on a scale that is almost unimaginable today. For women, the Renaissance was a particularly bleak time. Viewed as little more than the property of their fathers or husbands, they had few legal rights and were expected to conform to strict social and sexual mores. Even among the upper classes, women were often treated as pawns in political and dynastic games, married off to cement alliances or consolidate power. One woman who experienced the full force of this patriarchal oppression was Beatrice Cenci, a young Roman noblewoman who lived in the late 16th century. Born into a wealthy and powerful family, Beatrice was subjected to unspeakable abuse at the hands of her father, Francesco Cenci, a notorious libertine and sadist. According to contemporary accounts, Francesco regularly beat and raped his daughter, as well as his second wife and his other children. He was also rumoured to have murdered several servants and tenants who had crossed him. Despite his heinous crimes, however, Francesco was protected by his wealth and connections and seemed untouchable. Desperate to escape her father's clutches, Beatrice and her stepmother hatched a plot to have him assassinated. In 1598, they hired a group of hitmen who ambushed Francesco at his castle in Petrella Salto and bludgeoned him to death. But their scheme quickly unravelled, and Beatrice and her accomplices were arrested and brought back to Rome to face trial. In a shocking twist, the judges in the case decided to make an example of Beatrice, despite the overwhelming evidence of her father's depravity. Found guilty of patricide, she was sentenced to death, along with her stepmother and brothers. On September 11th, 1599, the 22-year-old Beatrice was led out to the scaffold in the Piazza del Popolo and beheaded before a huge crowd. Beatrice's story became a cause célèbre in Italy and beyond, inspiring countless works of art and literature over the centuries. For many, she was a symbol of the injustice and oppression faced by women in a society that valued them only as property and breeding stock. Her tragic fate was a reminder that, no matter how wealthy or well-connected a woman might be, she was still ultimately at the mercy of the men who controlled her life. But if the plight of women in the Renaissance was dire, that of religious and ethnic minorities was even worse. Across Europe, Jews, Muslims, and other non-Christian groups faced persecution, expulsion, and even extermination at the hands of the Catholic Church and its secular allies. One of the most notorious examples of this was the Spanish Inquisition, a campaign of terror launched by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella in 1478 to root out heresy and enforce religious conformity. Over the next 3 centuries, the Inquisition would torture, imprison, and execute tens of thousands of people, many of them Jews and Muslims who had been forcibly converted to Christianity. One of the Inquisition's most famous victims was a man named Luis de Carvajal, a converso, converted Jew, from a prominent New Christian family in Mexico City. Born in 1566, Luis was raised as a Catholic but secretly practiced Judaism, a crime punishable by death under Spanish law. In 1589, Luis and his family were denounced to the Inquisition by a disgruntled servant. Arrested and thrown into prison, they were subjected to brutal torture and interrogation in an effort to make them confess their heresy. Luis initially held out, but after months of suffering, he finally broke and admitted to being a practicing Jew. As punishment for his crimes, Luis was sentenced to be burned at the stake. On December 8th, 1596, he was led out to the Plaza Mayor in Mexico City, where a huge crowd had gathered to watch his execution. Tied to a stake and surrounded by piles of wood, Luis was given one last chance to recant his faith and save his life. But he refused, declaring that he would die a Jew. As the flames consumed his body, Luis recited the Shema, the Jewish prayer of faith, until his last breath. His courage in the face of unimaginable suffering became a source of inspiration for the secret Jews of Mexico and beyond, who saw him as a martyr for their cause. But Luis's story was just one of countless others in an age when religious intolerance was the norm. From the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492 to the massacres of Protestants in France during the Wars of Religion, the Renaissance was a time when difference was often met with violence and persecution. It's a reminder that, for all its glories, the Renaissance was also an age of darkness, when the light of reason and tolerance was often snuffed out by the forces of bigotry and superstition. As we look back on this complex and contradictory era, It's important to remember the untold stories of those who suffered and died in the shadows of history. For most people living during the Renaissance, life was a constant struggle against disease, hunger, and violence, without the benefit of modern medicine or sanitation even. The terrible sanitation conditions of Renaissance cities made disease outbreaks an ever-present danger. Imagine the putrid stench that would have assaulted your nostrils while walking down a typical street. Chamber pots and human waste were routinely emptied out of windows, splattering into the narrow alleys below. Animal carcasses, rotting kitchen scraps, and all manner of refuse littered the streets and open gutters. Swarms of flies buzzed incessantly around the piles of filth. The hot summer sun only intensified the fetid odours. To make matters worse, clean water was hard to come by. Public wells and fountains were often contaminated by the unsanitary conditions. Cholera, dysentery, and other waterborne diseases stalked the populace. Even the wealthy weren't immune. The famous composer Wolfgang Mozart likely died of a bacterial infection caused by impure water or spoiled meat. Let's follow a day in the life of Will, a common labourer in London in the 1500s, to see how he navigated this fetid urban landscape. Will awakens before dawn in the tiny, cramped room he shares with his wife and 4 children. The chamber pot in the corner is nearly overflowing from last night. He'll have to remember to empty it out the window later. Stepping out into the narrow street, the first thing that hits Will is the overpowering stench from the open sewer that runs down the centre of the lane. A mangy dog picks at a pile of rotting food scraps nearby. Will's bare feet squelch into something unpleasant, but there's no time to worry about that now. He has to get to work. He's one of the lucky ones to even have a job. As Will hurries through the twisting alleyways, he passes children playing amidst the rubbish and filth. A woman empties a basin of greasy water right into his path, but he dodges it with the nimbleness of long practice. The bells of nearby churches begin to ring, calling the pious to prayer, but Will hasn't been to church in years. No point in praying when his family is barely scraping by. Turning a corner, Will is startled by the grisly sight of a bloated corpse sprawled in the street. The man's skin is covered in weeping sores, a sure sign of the plague or maybe smallpox. Will averts his eyes and hurries past, pulling his cloak over his mouth and nose. He offers a silent prayer that the sickness doesn't find its way to his own door. Finally, Will arrives at the workshop where he's currently employed. The master craftsman barely acknowledges him, just jerks his head towards the day's work that needs doing. Will is used to this kind of treatment. He picks up his tools with a sigh. His hands are rough and calloused, his fingernails black with grime. Just another day of toil awaits. In the back of his mind, Will can't shake the memory of that diseased corpse in the street. He knows that could easily be his own fate someday, but for now, all he can do is focus on the task at hand and hope that he and his family can stay healthy. Life is precarious enough already in the crowded, filthy city, without the constant spectre of disease stalking the streets. Such was the lot of the common man in Renaissance London, surrounded by squalor, toiling in obscurity, always just one outbreak away from disaster. The glittering palaces and grand cathedrals might as well have been on another planet for all the good they did him. Will's story was all too typical of the vast majority of city dwellers at the time. But at least Will had a job, meagre as it might be. For many, grinding poverty was an inescapable reality. The Renaissance economy overwhelmingly favoured a small cadre of wealthy elites, while most of the population barely scraped by. Nowhere was this gaping inequality more apparent than in the Italian city-states, especially Florence. Wealthy banking families like the Medici wielded immense political and economic power. They built lavish palaces, commissioned grand works of art, and threw sumptuous feasts to impress their rivals. But for the struggling masses, life was very different. unskilled labourers, servants and peasants worked from sunup to sundown for meagre wages. Many were lucky to have a single set of tattered clothes and a thin pallet to sleep on at night. Meat was a rare luxury. A loaf of coarse bread and some watered-down ale or wine often had to suffice for sustenance. One of the most powerful banking families of Renaissance Italy was the mighty House of Medici in Florence. Rising from humble beginnings, the Medici built a vast financial empire through shrewd loans to the nobility and the church. With this wealth, they essentially ruled the city from behind the scenes, using a combination of strategic marriages, bribes, and strong-arm tactics. Under the leadership of savvy patriarchs like Cosimo de' Medici and his grandson Lorenzo the Magnificent, the family's power reached its zenith in the 15th century. They controlled the government, church, and guilds of Florence with an iron grip. Medici palaces glittered with priceless treasures, while lavish banquets and pageants dazzled the populace. The Medici were renowned patrons of the arts, supporting geniuses like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Botticelli. But this largesse came at a steep price for the people of Florence. The Medici maintained power in part by keeping a stranglehold on the city's grain supply, forcing the populace to pay exorbitant prices or face starvation. During times of famine or grain shortages, it was not uncommon to see starving peasants literally dropping dead in the streets outside the Medici palace walls. While the family hosted dazzling masked balls and feasted on delicacies from around the world, the average Florentine might not know where their next meal was coming from. This kind of heartless calculation was just business as usual for the ruthless Medici clan. They were the ultimate political puppet masters, making kings and popes dance to their tune. But for the struggling underclass, the Medici's ostentatious wealth and power must have seemed like a cruel joke. Imagine the bitter resentment a humble farmhand or washerwoman might have felt, toiling away for a few copper coins while the Medici and their cronies lived in opulent splendour. The gaping inequality of Renaissance society was impossible to ignore. But openly defying the likes of the Medici was unthinkable. They held the power of life and death over the citizenry. So the working poor of Florence had little choice but to keep their heads down, their bellies empty, and their anger internalized. They could only dream of the day when their oppressors might finally get their comeuppance. But such fantasies were little comfort in the face of backbreaking labour and gnawing hunger. Of course, even the wealthy and powerful were not immune to the many dangers of the age. Disease, violence, and political instability were constant spectres stalking the Renaissance world, ready to cut even the mightiest low without warning. The Italian city-states were a tumultuous patchwork of rival powers, constantly vying for dominance through warfare, espionage, and assassination. One of the most shocking examples was the overthrow of Duke Ludovico Sforza of Milan in 1499. Ludovico had been the de facto ruler of Milan for years, known as a cunning political operator and generous patron of the great Leonardo da Vinci. He earned the nickname Il Moro, the Moor, for his swarthy complexion. But Ludovico's ambitions and web of alliances eventually proved his undoing. Threatened by Ludovico's growing power, King Louis XII of France invaded Italy, determined to seize Milan for himself. After a series of disastrous military defeats, Ludovico's own mercenary army turned on him. The desperate duke disguised himself as a Swiss guard and attempted to flee the city. But he was captured, betrayed by the very men he had hired to protect him. The once mighty Ludovico was hauled back to Milan in chains and paraded before the jeering crowds. He was then exiled to France, where he would languish as a prisoner for the rest of his life. The great patron, the shrewd gamesman, the feared and respected lord, all reduced to a pitiful captive, robbed of everything he had schemed so hard to gain. It must have been a shocking fall from grace for a man who once held sway over the glittering court of Milan. But it was just another reminder of how quickly fortunes could reverse in the cutthroat world of Renaissance politics. No amount of wealth or genius could fully insulate you from the whims of fate. For the people of Milan, Ludovico's overthrow was just another upheaval in an endless cycle of them. The great battles and daring coups of the mighty meant little to the average citizen just trying to survive. Mercenary armies marched, cannons roared, and castles changed hands, but the lot of the common folk remained largely the same. The chaos and violence of the Italian wars raged on around them, a periodic scourge laying waste to town and countryside alike. One year, you might be going about your business in a peaceful city. The next, your home could be sacked and burned by rampaging French or Spanish troops, your family scattered or slaughtered. It was a time of great uncertainty, when even the most powerful could fall at any moment. The shifting alliances and fortunes of dukes and kings meant little to the humble farmer or artisan. They could only do their best to weather each new storm, to keep their heads down and their families fed. So while the great dramas of the age played out on the stage of history, the common people remained largely in the background, faceless and forgotten, toiling on as best they could through each new upheaval. The Renaissance was a time of great art and learning, but also of great suffering and turmoil for the voiceless masses. And few were more voiceless or downtrodden than women and minorities in Renaissance society. They faced oppression, persecution, and prejudice at every turn, their basic humanity often denied. For women, life was especially restricted and precarious. Viewed as little more than property of their fathers or husbands, they had precious few rights or freedoms. Education was limited, career options almost non-existent. A woman's value lay in her virtue and fertility, her ability to bear sons and uphold the family honour. From birth to death, women were under the thumb of the men in their lives. Fathers ruled the roost, arranging marriages for political or economic advantage with little concern for their daughters' wishes. Once wed, a woman became the property of her husband, expected to obey his every command. Domestic abuse and sexual violence were rampant, but considered a husband's prerogative. Divorce was almost impossible, condemning women to a lifetime of misery with cruel or unfaithful spouses. And woe to the woman who dared to take a lover of her own. The punishment was fierce and swift. A woman's role was in the home, running the household and raising children. But even this was no haven. Childbirth was agonizingly painful and terribly dangerous without modern medicine. Many women died in labor or shortly after from infections. Those who survived often faced a lifetime of unending pregnancies, watching many of their babies perish from disease and malnutrition. The few women who dared to break the mold faced immense obstacles. The brilliant scholar Cassandra Fedele fought for her education in a society that believed women were incapable of higher learning. The great artist Sofonisba Anguissola had to battle every step of the way for recognition in the male-dominated art world. But for the vast majority of women, even these limited freedoms were out of reach. They remained cloistered and shackled, their dreams and ambitions throttled by the rigid confines of their society. It's hard to fathom the depths of frustration, despair, and sheer boredom that must have plagued so many half-lives, forever stunted. And yet, women found what small ways they could to assert their humanity in a world stacked against them. They formed deep bonds with each other, found solace in religion and charitable works. Some, like the great poet Vittoria Colonna, managed to make their voices heard against all odds. But they were the rare exceptions. For most women, the Renaissance was a gilded cage, a suffocating existence of unending drudgery and forced silence. Their pain and struggles were simply a fact of life, as unremarkable as the turning of the seasons. Half the human race, forever consigned to the shadows. and they were hardly alone in their plight. The Renaissance world was viciously intolerant of anyone who didn't fit the narrow mold of Christian orthodoxy. Jews, Muslims, and other religious minorities faced constant threat of persecution, expulsion, or worse. The Jewish community was especially vulnerable, subject to all manner of restrictions and abuses. Banned from most professions, many were forced into the precarious role of moneylenders, which only fueled anti-Semitic stereotypes and resentment. They were forced to wear distinctive clothing like yellow badges, herded into cramped ghettos, subjected to periodic mob violence and blood libel. The constant fear of sudden expulsion or forced conversion hung over every Jewish home. One such figure was Jehiel de Pisa, a prominent Jewish moneylender in Renaissance Italy. Jehiel was a respected member of his community, known for his learning and piety. But his success also made him a target of Christian envy and suspicion. Like many Jewish lenders, Jehiel walked a tightrope, relying on the begrudging protection of the authorities, while also facing their periodic wrath. He was imprisoned by the tyrannical Duke Galeazzo Maria Sforza on trumped-up charges, only to be released when the Duke needed his financial services again. Jehiel's story highlights the precariousness of Jewish existence in the Renaissance. No amount of wealth or good works could fully shield them from the capricious violence and predations of the Christian majority. They survived at the whim of popes and princes, forever scapegoats for any societal ill. And this was a relatively enlightened age compared to what came before or after. The Spanish Inquisition and expulsion of the Jews was a dark foreshadowing of the horrors to come. The ghettos and badges and blood libels never really went away, so for Jehiel and the rest of his people, the glories of the Renaissance rang hollow. They remained a suspect and despised minority, clinging to their ancient faith in a hostile world. The soaring cathedrals and grand palaces of the age were not for them, only the squalid margins to which they'd been consigned. It's a stark reminder that even the most dazzling eras of human achievement are often built on foundations of cruelty and injustice. The Renaissance was a time of both light and shadow, with the former too often reserved for a privileged few, and the latter the lot of too many. But perhaps no shadow loomed larger than the ever-present spectre of death. For all the glories of Renaissance art and learning, the age remained in the chokehold of woefully primitive medicine and sanitation. For rich and poor alike, health was terrifically fragile, with few reliable remedies for the myriad deadly threats stalking the populace. Chief among these was the devastating scourge of plague. The Black Death had already ravaged Europe in the 14th century, wiping out a third of the population. But the deadly bacterium continued to rear its head in periodic local outbreaks, well into the Renaissance period and beyond. The Italian city of Florence was especially hard hit in the summer of 1527. A plague began raging through the cramped streets, carried by rat fleas and spreading like wildfire among the densely packed populace. Panic gripped the city as hospitals overflowed and bodies began piling up in the streets. The Florentine ambassador, Raffaello Girolami, wrote in horror of the apocalyptic scenes. In this small lazaretto, over 400 die of plague daily, and they pile them into mass graves, 20 or 30 together. Throughout the city, it's impossible to find a house without some sick. I have seen children still suckling their dead mother's breast. The particular cruelty of Renaissance plagues was that people still had no concept of how they spread or how to contain them. Desperate patients subjected themselves to all manner of gruesome and useless cures, like mercury rubs, boil lancing, and bloodletting. Many simply resigned themselves to their fate. The wealthy did their best to flee stricken cities, but even they could not fully escape the ravages of plague. The disease respected no social class boundaries. A Medici or Borgia was just as vulnerable as a humble artisan once the telltale buboes began to swell in the armpits and groin. And this was just one of many deadly ailments stalking the Renaissance populace. Smallpox, syphilis, tuberculosis, dysentery, all carved great swaths through the population with terrifying regularity. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly high, with a third to half of all children dying before the age of 5. Even for those who escaped the ravages of disease, life was a fragile proposition. Malnutrition left people vulnerable to a host of illnesses. Sanitation was almost non-existent, with open sewers and contaminated water spreading pestilence. Workplace accidents, crime and violence snuffed out lives abruptly and senselessly. And for women, the dangers of childbirth loomed especially large. Without modern obstetrics, even a seemingly uncomplicated pregnancy could quickly turn deadly for both mother and child. Ah yes, the Inquisition, yet another charming aspect of life during the supposedly enlightened Renaissance. While great artists were painting Madonnas and cherubs, the Spanish Inquisition was hard at work, purging the land of heretics, infidels, and anyone else who ran afoul of the Catholic Church's rigid dogma. Founded in 1478 by King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile, the Inquisition began as a way to root out heresy among Spain's Jewish and Muslim converts to Christianity. Many of these conversos fell under suspicion for continuing to practice their old faiths in secret. As time went on, the Inquisition expanded its targets to include Protestants, witches, bigamists, blasphemers, and basically anyone who looked at a bishop funny. The Inquisition was essentially the Renaissance world's thought police. A massive bureaucracy sprang up to investigate accusations of heresy, haul suspects before a tribunal, and mete out punishments to the guilty. And by punishments, we mean torture. Lots and lots of torture. Those unlucky souls who found themselves locked in the Inquisition's dungeons could look forward to being stretched on the rack, hung by their wrists, or having their feet slowly roasted over a fire until they confessed. Because obviously a confession obtained under torture is completely reliable, right? The lucky ones got off with a few lashes or a stint in prison. The not-so-lucky were sentenced to burn at the stake in public autos da fe, festive celebrations of pious sadism that the whole town turned out to watch. It's estimated that the Spanish Inquisition alone prosecuted around 150,000 people and executed about 5,000 over the course of its nearly 350-year reign of terror. But the Spanish were by no means the only ones getting in on the Inquisition action. Local inquisitions popped up in Portugal, Italy, France, and pretty much anywhere the Catholic Church held sway. Even the relatively progressive Venice had its own inquisition to sniff out heretical influence from those perfidious Protestants. Truly, no Renaissance city was complete without a crack squad of theological enforcers to keep the rabble in line. For a glimpse of what it was like to live under this oppressive climate of suspicion and paranoia, let's peek in on the Aguilar family of Toledo. Diego Aguilar was a successful spice merchant and a converso whose Jewish ancestors had reluctantly converted during the mass expulsions of 1492. Diego did his best to play the part of a good Christian, attending Mass regularly and even serving on the parish council. But privately, he clung to his Jewish identity, teaching his children Hebrew prayers and secretly observing Shabbat and kosher dietary laws. All it took was one disgruntled servant to bring the Aguilar's world crashing down. The maid, bitter over being fired, denounced the entire family to the local inquisitor, claiming she had seen them engaged in Jewish rituals behind closed doors. In the dead of night, Diego and his wife Maria were dragged from their beds by armed familiars of the Inquisition and hauled off to the secret prisons for questioning. There, Diego steadfastly maintained his innocence, even as his interrogators turned to harsher and harsher methods to induce his confession. Poor Maria, meanwhile, wasn't able to withstand the agonies of the rack. She broke down and admitted that the family had indeed been practicing Judaism in secret. Her confession sealed her husband's fate. Found guilty of Judaizing and relapsed heresy, Diego Aguilar was sentenced to burn. He and a dozen other condemned heretics were marched out to the public square, tied to stakes, and set ablaze before a jeering crowd. The thick, choking smoke and stench of charred flesh was probably almost enough to cover up the usual odors of sewage and filth wafting through the streets of Toledo. As for Maria, her coerced confession saved her from the stake, but she was forced to endure the shame of a public auto da fe, wearing the penitent's San Benito, and spent the next 7 years wasting away in the Inquisition's prisons. The family's property was seized and their children farmed out to good Christian households to be raised properly in the faith. The Aguilar's tragedy was all too common in Spain and beyond throughout the duration of the Inquisition. Piety and orthodoxy were the order of the day, and the Inquisition made sure everyone knew that the wages of heresy was death. So much for the Renaissance as a time of free inquiry and religious tolerance. I guess no historical age can be all humanism and enlightenment. There's always going to be some fire and brimstone mixed in there somewhere. While the Inquisition was originally intended to police the beliefs of converts and so-called new Christians, it eventually spread its net far wider, seeing enemies of the faith around every corner. Protestants were an obvious target once the Reformation began making inroads into Catholic lands in the 16th century. In Spain, sympathy for the Protestant cause could earn you a burning, as the imperial Habsburg rulers sought to keep Luther's heresy from contaminating their subjects' souls. Likewise, John Calvin's Reformed theology became a capital crime. Even in the more religiously fractured lands of the Holy Roman Empire, the Inquisition reared its head in pockets where Catholicism still reigned. Clandestine Protestant cells were rooted out and suppressed with extreme prejudice. You can almost imagine Monty Python's Inquisition bursting onto the scene. Nobody expects the Protestant Reformation. Our chief weapon is surprise, except with more blood and screaming. But perhaps the most notorious excess of Europe's collective Inquisition fever was the witch hunts that raged in the 16th and 17th centuries. Now, the Inquisition didn't really take witchcraft all that seriously at first. Sure, it was technically heresy, but it ranked pretty low on the Inquisitors' list of priorities. That is, until the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, in 1487. Written by a German churchman named Heinrich Kramer, this infamous text whipped up a moral panic by arguing that witchcraft was a very real and present danger that required immediate eradication. He claimed that witches gained their malevolent powers by making pacts with Satan and cavorting with demons at their vile Sabbath orgies. What's more, Kramer had some pretty spicy ideas about gender. He argued that women were highly susceptible to the devil's influence due to their moral and intellectual inferiority. Ouch. With these kinds of ideas floating around, it's no surprise that an estimated 80% of the unfortunate souls prosecuted for witchcraft were women. Accusations of witchcraft became a convenient way to get rid of troublesome neighbours, unpopular local figures, and anyone who was a bit too odd for the community's liking. Got a wart on your nose? Enjoy keeping cats around? Have a habit of muttering to yourself? Watch out, or you just might get denounced as a bride of Satan. The lucky ones managed to endure a few rounds of torture and then convince their interrogators of their innocence. The rest ended up hanged, beheaded, or burned as unrepentant servants of the devil. All told, it's estimated that the Inquisition oversaw the prosecution of some 100,000 alleged witches over the 16th and 17th centuries, of whom perhaps 60,000 were executed. Not exactly enlightened jurisprudence, but that's inquisitorial justice for you. Lest you think all this was just the result of a few fanatical clerics, the Inquisition had the full weight of secular authorities behind it as well. The auto da fe of witches and heretics was a social event attended by everyone from the local peasantry to the high and mighty of the land. When the first major witch trials were held in the Spanish Basque country in 1610, King Philip III himself made the journey to watch the convicted witches burn. Nothing like the smell of roasting sorceresses to add a bit of zest to the royal progress. Of course, the excesses of the witch hunts eventually became too much for even the most ardent inquisitors to stomach. In 1631, the same Philip III's son Philip IV finally reigned in the Inquisition, ordering that relapsed heretics could no longer be burned without direct royal approval. It was a small step, but it marked the beginning of the end for the Inquisition's most egregious brutalities. Still, the damage had been done. The Spanish Inquisition limped along as a shadow of its former self, still occasionally prosecuting cases of heresy and blasphemy, until it was finally abolished in 1834. By then, the rest of Europe had long since left the Inquisition behind, though the scars it left on the continent's psyche lingered. It just goes to show, even the most progressive of eras can have a dark underbelly. The Renaissance may have been a time of soaring artistic and intellectual achievements, but it was also an age of religious fanaticism, intolerance, and state-sponsored terror. Not exactly something they teach you in Art History 101. So there you have it, the Inquisition in all its grim ignominy. Just one more example of how life in the Renaissance wasn't exactly all painting in Tuscany and dancing at masquerade balls. The Inquisition may have had to compete with disease, filth, and rampant poverty for the top spot of most unpleasant part of Renaissance existence, but it certainly gave the Black Death a run for its money. All those Renaissance philosophers yammering on about human dignity clearly forgot to CC the Inquisition on that particular memo. Of course, having your feet roasted and getting burned as a witch was still probably preferable to attending a 4-hour humanist symposium on Neoplatonic interpretations of Cicero, but only just barely. I kid. In all seriousness, though, the Inquisition stands as a sobering reminder of the human capacity for cruelty and intolerance, even in the midst of a flowering of culture and progress. It's a side of the Renaissance that often gets left out of the picture books and Assassin's Creed games. But hey, we're not here to start our day off with a big bummeroo history lesson. We're here to drift off into a peaceful, ignorance is bliss slumber. So let's leave the Inquisition and all its attendant unpleasantries behind us and move on to less torturous topics, like, say, the rampant xenophobia and slave trade of Renaissance Europe. That ought to be just the thing to lull you off to dreamland. But we'll save that particular bedtime story for another night. Sweet dreams. As we've seen, beneath the glimmering surface of Renaissance art and culture, there often lurked a dark underbelly of oppression, persecution, and inequality. The flowery poetry and soaring cathedral spires tended to be reserved for society's upper echelons, while the huddled masses scraped by in squalor. But perhaps no institution embodied this disconnect more starkly than the notorious Spanish Inquisition. While the great Italian masters were painting Madonnas and Greek myths, the Inquisition was ruthlessly hunting down Jews, Muslims, and unorthodox Christians under the guise of religious purity. Imagine for a moment you are a Jew living in Madrid in the late 15th century. Despite your family having called Spain home for generations, you now live in constant fear. The ominous threat of the Inquisition looms over you like a spectre. You've heard the whispered stories. Friends and neighbours dragged from their homes, imprisoned, tortured, burned at the stake, all for the supposed crime of heresy. Maybe the Inquisitor's eye falls upon you because the pork stew you ate last week didn't seem convincing enough. Or maybe your salty old uncle slips up and mutters a Hebrew prayer. It could be anything. The Inquisition needs only the faintest hint of suspicion to pounce and prosecute. And so you are ever vigilant, attending Mass each week, hanging a crucifix prominently in your home, concealing any trace of your Jewish heritage or customs behind closed doors. leading a harrowing double life, never knowing if the next knock will be your last. The Inquisition doesn't see your humanity. To them, you are vermin to be rooted out and exterminated for the good of Christendom. Such was the terror faced by thousands across the Iberian Peninsula as the Inquisition reached its zenith under the notorious Tomás de Torquemada in the 1480s. Himself of Jewish ancestry, Torquemada prosecuted supposed heretics with a fanatical zeal as Grand Inquisitor for over 15 years. The spectre of the Inquisition that would loom over Spain for centuries begins here, with Torquemada writing the very first inquisitorial manual codifying its cruel practices. And the Spanish Inquisition was far from the only crusade waged against those who didn't fit the prevailing religious orthodoxy of the age. The Reformation was now in full swing, and Catholic authorities were determined to stamp it out by any means necessary. Across Europe, the tide of Protestantism was met with torture, burnings, beheadings on a mass scale. Meanwhile, the flames of anti-Semitism spread like wildfire, fueled by the Inquisition. In 1492, the same year Columbus sailed the ocean blue, Ferdinand and Isabella gave Spain's Jews a stark choice: convert or face expulsion. Thousands were forced to flee their ancestral homeland, an exodus born of intolerance, mirroring the pogroms and persecutions inflicted on Jews time and again throughout Renaissance Europe. And of course, we cannot overlook the cruel madness of the witch trials that swept through the continent in the 16th and 17th centuries. Countless women, and more than a few men, were accused of witchcraft on the flimsiest of pretexts. Superstition, misogyny, and mass hysteria created a perfect storm that consumed between 40,000 to 60,000 victims. Most were hanged, others tortured and burned alive, their only crime being powerless and different in a society primed to fear them. Take the story of Ursula Kemp, an Englishwoman who worked as a healer and midwife in the 1580s. When a few of her patients failed to recover, she was blamed for bewitching them. Accusations multiplied and flew as they so often did. Jealous neighbors denounced her as a witch, spinning wild tales of dark magic and consorting with demons. Poor Ursula never stood a chance against the might of church and state. She was arrested, stripped, and searched for a witch's mark. When no physical proof could be found, she was subjected to sleep deprivation and threats until she finally confessed to being a witch and a bad woman. In 1582, Ursula Kemp was hanged for a crime she did not commit, like so many other innocent women swept up in the tide of hysteria. Zoom out for a moment to consider the tragic irony at play. The Renaissance is often heralded as a triumph of humanism, a celebration of the beauty, potential, and worth inherent in every individual. An age where the supreme dignity of the human spirit reigned supreme. Tell that to Ursula Kemp as she dangles from the gallows simply for being an outsider. Tell it to the Jews and Moriscos of Spain, driven from their homes for praying to the wrong God. Tell it to anyone who fell afoul of the religious fervour and intolerance that gripped so much of Renaissance Europe. Humanism is a fine notion for the privileged few who pen epic poetry by candlelight. But it was in short supply for the marginalised souls snared by the Inquisition's cold hand. This is the Renaissance too few talk about, the one where ancient hatreds and prejudices found new outlets, where the same intellectual vibrancy that yielded sublime artworks also contorted into strict religious dogmas brutally enforced. It seems the light of human potential celebrated in the era's art and philosophy cast some very dark shadows indeed. And speaking of shadows, have you ever stopped to ponder how the average Renaissance peasant passed the long hours between sunset and sunrise? It can be hard for us to imagine, so accustomed as we are to abundant artificial lighting that banishes the night with the flick of a switch. But for much of human history, true darkness reigned over half of most people's lives. Our Renaissance forebears didn't have electricity, much less smart bulbs or three-way lamps. When night fell, it fell hard. The only feeble glimmers to be had were flickering candles, smoky rushlights, perhaps a sputtering oil lamp if you were well off. And even those extravagances were used sparingly by all but the wealthiest. Tallow candles were an expensive luxury for the average soul. You'd be lucky to burn one for an hour or two before being plunged back into shadow. So what was an humble peasant to do once their meagre light ration was exhausted? The same thing generations had always done: go to bed. Without the unnatural disruption of artificial light, most people's circadian rhythms were intimately attuned to the rising and setting of the sun. When darkness blanketed the land, they took it as a cue to retire, rising again with the cockerel's crow at dawn. But in that interval between dusk and slumber, people often whiled away an hour or two immersed in the dark. They'd stare into the dying embers of the hearth, trade stories, indulge in some evening hanky-panky. The night was a time for quiet intimacies that the harsh light of day didn't allow. Of course, darkness also held its fair share of terrors for Renaissance folks. Evil spirits and witches were thought to prowl the shadows beyond the safety of the home fires. Criminals and brigands used the cover of night for all manner of skullduggery, and the lack of illumination made even simple tasks like answering nature's call fraught with peril. Many a medieval peasant likely took a nasty tumble fumbling for the chamber pot in the dark. So the next time you switch off your bedside lamp and snuggle in for a restful 8 hours, take a moment to appreciate that simple luxury. For a Renaissance serf, the night was a far more consuming, mysterious affair. They lived half their lives in a darkness we can scarcely imagine, making their own meagre light against the void. It's a darkness that in our 24/7 world has become yet another obscure relic of a distant age. But let's step out of the shadows and into the revealing light of day to meet one of the great minds of the Renaissance, although he was not recognized as such in his lifetime. His name was Bernardino Telesio, and his story speaks volumes about the era's intellectual climate. Born to a noble family in southern Italy in 1509, Telesio was a quintessential Renaissance man. Deeply versed in the classics, he penned works of philosophy, mathematics, and poetry with equal aplomb. But his true passion lay in plumbing the secrets of the natural world. At a time when most still looked to the Bible and ancient Greeks for their science, Telesio dared to trust his own senses and observations. In his masterwork On the Nature of Things, published in 1565, Telesio laid out a shockingly modern vision. He argued that the universe was governed not by divine caprice, but by ironclad physical laws that could be sussed out through reason and experimentation. Heat and cold were the fundamental forces that shaped all of creation, from the orbits of the planets down to the humours of the body. It was a materialist worldview that left little room for God or mysticism. Such radical notions were bound to raise eyebrows in Counter-Reformation Italy. Although Telesio was a devout Catholic, his ideas reeked of heresy to the snouts of the Inquisition. As the revised edition of his magnum opus flew off the printing press in 1570, they pounced. The book was banned, the unsold copies seized and burned. Any remaining volumes had to include humiliating revisions to make them more palatable to the church. Telesio himself escaped the wrath of the Inquisition. He had friends in very high places like Pope Pius IV. But his revolutionary theories were suppressed, lost to all but a few scattered disciples. The Inquisition had made its point loud and clear. There was no room in the Renaissance for a science unshackled from religious dogma. It would be another century before the Enlightenment truly established the supremacy of empirical reason over blind faith. Bernardino Telesio was a man born out of time, a tragic prophet whose dangerous ideas were stamped out before they could truly take root. He died in 1588, his ultimate dream of a science guided solely by nature's truths, unfulfilled but unextinguished. And there you have yet another defining paradox of the Renaissance encapsulated in a single man. The rediscovery of classical knowledge was meant to enlighten and elevate the age. But when that knowledge threatened the powers that be, it was ruthlessly suppressed by the same church that had once been the great patron of Renaissance learning. A reminder that an idea can be both ahead of its time and on the wrong side of history. For those on the margins and fringes of Renaissance society, for the Bernardino Telesios and Ursula Kemps, life wasn't just harsh and unpleasant. It could be cut brutally short for thought crimes against the status quo. The light of learning that still dazzles us from the era often casts the darkest of shadows over those who failed to stay in the lines. Something to muse on, perhaps, in those liminal moments between wakefulness and sleep, when the mind is alone with itself in the dark. The Renaissance remains an endlessly complex tapestry, radiant and blood-soaked all at once. In teasing out its darker threads, we simply seek to know it more completely, more truly, to confront the cruelty and contradiction that forever lurked beneath the glittering surface. Only then can we begin to reckon with the Renaissance as it really was, a time out of joint, straining between a longing for rebirth and the weight of its own intolerance. An age where the same hand that mixed paint for timeless frescoes might have put the torch to a supposed heretic. It is as much a part of the story as the Last Supper or the Sistine Chapel. And that story, in all its difficult beauty, is still being written upon every soul that ponders it, half a millennium on. As we've seen, the glittering image of the Renaissance as a golden age of human achievement often obscures the harsh realities faced by the vast majority of people living through this tumultuous time. While a privileged few enjoyed lavish palaces and grand works of art, most toiled in obscurity, struggling against poverty, disease, oppression, and violence. But perhaps no one embodies both the soaring triumphs and tragic downfalls of the Renaissance better than the brilliant Italian artist and inventor Leonardo da Vinci. Born out of wedlock to a notary and a peasant woman in the small Tuscan town of Vinci, Leonardo's genius would carry him to the heights of fame and influence, yet even he could not fully escape the difficulties of his age. As a young apprentice in the Florence workshop of the renowned artist Andrea del Verrocchio, Leonardo quickly distinguished himself with his keen mind and unparalleled artistic abilities. His now famous notebooks overflow with stunningly detailed sketches and schematics on everything from human anatomy to flying machines, laying the groundwork for entire branches of scientific study. Powerful patrons like the Duke of Milan and the Medici family of Florence vied for his services, recognizing him as a polymath, the likes of which the world had rarely seen. However, this fame and success came at a price. Leonardo was notoriously slow to finish commissions, often leaving works incomplete as he pursued his boundless curiosity down countless rabbit holes. This tendency strained his relationships with impatient clients who failed to appreciate his painstaking attention to detail and relentless perfectionism. His famed The Last Supper began to deteriorate almost as soon as he set down his brush due to an ill-advised experimental painting technique. The Mona Lisa, likely his most well-known work today, was never actually delivered to its original commissioner, and his grand 24-foot-tall equestrian statue for the Duke of Milan was scrapped before it could be cast when war forced Leonardo to flee the city, leaving only a clay model that was later used for target practice by French archers. Leonardo also lived under constant threat of persecution for his presumed homosexuality, then condemned as sodomy by the Catholic Church and a crime punishable by death. He was twice formally accused of this offence, though he escaped conviction. One of Leonardo's lovers, the handsome artist's model Salai, gained a reputation for his flamboyant dress and behaviour, which only increased the scandal. As the political tides of the ever-warring Italian city-states continued to turn, Leonardo found himself forced to abandon his home and workshop multiple times. leaving many of his works and writings scattered or destroyed. The ultimate Renaissance man died in France in obscurity, exiled from his beloved homeland. It would be centuries before the true scope of his visionary brilliance was recognized. The life of Leonardo da Vinci showcases the double-edged nature of fame and ambition in an age when even the most celebrated geniuses could find themselves brought low by social strictures, religious intolerance, and the capricious whims of wealthy patrons. It serves as a poignant reminder that the shining legacy of the Renaissance was built on a foundation of human struggle we ought not forget. Of course, Leonardo and his wealthy aristocratic patrons were still the lucky ones. For the average labourer, merchant or soldier, the Italian Renaissance remained defined more by back-breaking work, untreated ailments, and the constant spectre of war than by glorious works of art or groundbreaking heliocentrism. Nowhere was this clearer than on the blood-soaked battlefields crisscrossing the Italian peninsula, as the rulers of Florence, Milan, Venice, Naples, and the Papal States fought endlessly for regional power and dominance. Their wars were often prosecuted by the condottieri, mercenary warlords whose loyalty lasted only as long as the gold lining their pockets. One of the most successful condottieri captains was the canny Francesco Busoni, better known as Carmagnola. Rising from humble peasant origins, Carmagnola proved his prowess as a tactical commander in the service of the expansionist Duke Filippo Maria Visconti of Milan. His string of victories against rival cities swelled not only the Duke's territory, but also Carmagnola's own coffers and clout. However, Carmagnola's ambition would prove to be his downfall. Feeling underappreciated by Duke Visconti, he defected to Milan's great maritime rival, the Republic of Venice, taking his skills to the opposing side in the long conflict. Leading the Venetian forces to several smashing victories, Carmagnola was hailed as a hero in his new adopted city and rewarded with lands and titles. But Carmagnola had a habit of undermining his own patrons, snatching up captured cities for his own enrichment rather than turning them over to Venice. Combined with a few key military losses, this was enough for the ever-plotting Venetian Council of Ten to brand their former champion a traitor. In 1432, Carmagnola was lured back to Venice, arrested, and brutally executed between the famed columns of St. Mark's Square as a warning to others who might be tempted to cross La Serenissima. The blood-splattered parabola of Carmagnola's rise and fall showcases the cutthroat realpolitik of the Italian city-states, where today's beloved hero could become tomorrow's headless corpse. It reveals the expendability of even seemingly powerful men in an age when violence was the rule rather than the exception, and life could be snuffed out in an instant. But perhaps no one was considered more expendable in Renaissance Italy than those who found themselves condemned of heresy by the Roman Catholic Church. In an era when religious devotion was as much about political loyalty as personal faith, any deviation from orthodox doctrine could carry dire consequences. One of the most prominent victims of religious persecution during the Renaissance was the brilliant Dominican friar Giordano Bruno. Born in 1548 near Naples, Bruno took holy orders as a young man, but quickly ran afoul of his superiors for his controversial views on theology, cosmology, and philosophy. A voracious reader and freethinker, Bruno devoured ancient texts and cutting-edge Renaissance humanist scholarship with equal relish. He developed a unique worldview that blended Neoplatonic mysticism with Copernican heliocentrism, arguing for an infinite universe populated by endless worlds, a direct challenge to the Church's Aristotelian geocentric dogma. Bruno's provocative ideas made him a target of the Roman Inquisition, forcing him to flee his native Italy to avoid arrest. He spent years wandering Europe, finding temporary refuge in the more tolerant courts of France, England, and Germany. But he could not hold his tongue, continuing to write and debate his radical cosmological and philosophical notions. His fiery temper and acerbic wit didn't win him many friends either. He made enemies of powerful figures like the famed French mathematician Fabrizio Mordente, whose prized compass design Bruno mocked as inaccurate. Mordente would later testify against Bruno before the Inquisition, accusing him of plagiarism. In 1592, Bruno made the fateful decision to return to Italy under the protection of a powerful Venetian patron. But once again, his controversial views and abrasive manner brought him to the attention of the Inquisition. He was arrested and extradited to Rome to face charges of heresy. Bruno's trial lasted 7 years, during which he was repeatedly interrogated and pressured to recant his unorthodox beliefs. But he refused to back down, insisting that his ideas were compatible with Christianity and that the Church was wrong to suppress the free exchange of knowledge. In the end, Bruno's intransigence sealed his fate. In 1600, he was declared a heretic and sentenced to death. He is said to have defiantly told his accusers, "Perhaps you pronounce this sentence against me with greater fear than I receive it." Bruno was burned at the stake in the Campo de' Fiori in Rome, his ashes scattered in the Tiber River. The tragic tale of Giordano Bruno exemplifies the dangerous battle lines between faith, reason, and authority in the Renaissance era. It reveals how even the most brilliant minds could find themselves silenced and destroyed for daring to question the prevailing orthodoxy of their time. Bruno's story also highlights the often overlooked diversity of thought during the Renaissance. Far from a monolithic march of progress, it was an age of vibrant intellectual discourse and debate, where unconventional ideas could flourish in the margins even as they were suppressed by the powers that be. These same fault lines would erupt into full-scale conflict a few decades after Bruno's death with the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation, plunging Europe into a century of religious warfare. The exuberant humanism of the Renaissance would give way to the rigid dogmatism of the Baroque as the Catholic Church reasserted its authority with a new militant zeal. But even in this age of upheaval and uncertainty, pockets of light and learning continued to shine. From the literary salons of Venice and Naples to the scientific academies of Paris and London, the legacy of the Renaissance lived on in the minds and hearts of those who dared to dream of a better world. As we look back on this pivotal period of history from our vantage point in the present, it's easy to get lost in the grand narratives of progress and decline, of heroes and villains, of light and shadow. But the reality, as always, is far more complex and nuanced. The Renaissance was an age of both soaring triumphs and crushing tragedies, of both breathtaking beauty and stomach-churning brutality. It was a time when the human spirit reached for the heavens, even as it remained mired in the muck of ignorance, superstition, and cruelty. To truly understand the Renaissance, we must grapple with all of these contradictions and paradoxes. We must see it not as a mythic golden age or a dark abyss, but as a deeply human era, full of flawed individuals struggling to make sense of their world and their place in it. In the end, perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Renaissance is that the pursuit of knowledge, beauty, and progress is always an unfinished project, one that each generation must take up anew in the face of its own challenges and limitations. It is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the spark of human creativity and resilience can never be fully extinguished. So let us remember the Renaissance not just for its glories, but also for its struggles. Let us honor the memory of those who dared to challenge the status quo, even at the cost of their own lives. And let us carry forward their spirit of inquiry, empathy, and hope as we navigate the uncharted waters of our own time. For in the end, the true legacy of the Renaissance is not the specific works of art or ideas it produced, but the enduring belief in the power of the human mind and spirit to shape our world for the better. It is a legacy that belongs to all of us, and one that we must continue to nurture and defend, even in the face of great adversity. As we drift off to sleep tonight, let us dream of a world where the light of reason and compassion shines brighter than the darkness of ignorance and fear. A world where every human being has the opportunity to fulfill their God-given potential, free from the shackles of oppression and injustice. This is the world that the great thinkers and artists of the Renaissance dared to imagine, even if they could not fully realize it in their own time. It is a world that we must continue to strive for, in our own small way, with each passing day. So let us rest now, secure in the knowledge that the story of human progress is still being written, and that each of us has a role to play in shaping its next chapter. For in the end, the true meaning of the Renaissance is not something that can be found in a history book or a museum, but in the endless capacity of the human heart to dream, to create, and to love. Good night, and sweet dreams of a brighter tomorrow. And so, while a select few enjoyed the flourishing of art and culture during the Renaissance, the harsh realities of daily life remained inescapable for the vast majority. As we've seen, even for those living in the grand cultural centres like Florence or Venice, existence was often a relentless struggle. If disease, starvation or violence didn't claim you, the spectre of religious persecution constantly loomed. The opulence and brilliance we associate with the Renaissance was but a thin veneer over a much bleaker reality for most. Nowhere were these stark contrasts more apparent than in the realities faced by women of the time. While a few exceptional individuals like the renowned painter Sophonisba Anguissola managed to thrive, their success was starkly juxtaposed against the subjugation and limitations imposed on their gender as a whole. Born into an aristocratic family in Cremona in 1532, Sophonisba was given opportunities few women could dream of. At a time when women were largely confined to domestic roles, she received a robust education alongside her sisters. Her father Amilcare recognized and nurtured her prodigious artistic talents from a young age. Under the tutelage of respected masters like Bernardino Campi and Bernardino Gatti, Sophonisba honed her skills as a portraitist. Her penetrating realism and thoughtful characterizations soon earned her widespread renown. In 1559, her fame reached the Spanish court, where she would serve as a lady-in-waiting and art tutor to Queen Elizabeth of Valois. For over a decade, Sophonisba thrived in this rarefied environment, even earning the admiration of the austere King Philip II himself. Her portraits of the royal family were lauded across Europe. Most astonishing of all, she achieved this eminence while still an unmarried woman under 30, a feat vanishingly rare for the era. But Sophonisba's charmed existence stood in sharp relief against the constraints shackling most Renaissance women. Her own sister Elena, also a gifted artist, was forced to enter a convent where her talents withered. Lavinia Fontana of Bologna, another rare woman to forge a successful painting career, grappled with 11 pregnancies while struggling to earn commissions. These fortunate few who achieved a measure of agency and renown were the exception, not the rule. For the overwhelming majority, the same strictures and limitations that had always bound them remained firmly in place. From the lowest peasant girl to the noblest lady, a woman's worth was still defined by her utility to the men who ruled over her. Her role was to serve as a subservient daughter, a dutiful wife, and a fecund mother. Any deviation from this preordained path was harshly punished. A woman was, in essence, the property of her male relatives, to be bartered and betrothed as they saw fit. Whereas a man might expect to choose his own bride, a woman had little say in whom she married or when. And once wed, her very identity was subsumed into that of her husband. As the renowned scholar Erasmus wrote, a good wife should be the husband's best furniture, his most prized possession. The sentiment encapsulates the objectification and subjugation that defined a woman's lot, no matter her standing. Perhaps Queen Catherine de' Medici of France wielded great influence from behind the scenes, but how many nameless servant girls suffered in silence? The accomplished poet Veronica Franco may have mingled with the Venetian elite, but how many women languished illiterate and unheard? For each brilliant star who managed to shine in the firmament, countless others were snuffed out before they ever had a chance to burn. While prodigious talents like Sophonisba Anguissola served as beacons of what women could achieve given opportunity, they remained the rare lights in an otherwise stifling darkness. The advances of the Renaissance did little to alter the fundamental reality for the vast majority of women, that their fates and fortunes would be dictated by the men who held mastery over them. The lofty humanism and enlightenment for which the era is exalted offered them no egress from an age-old paradigm of oppression. So while we marvel at the masterpieces gracing gilded galleries and read the profound words of luminaries like Petrarch and Erasmus, let us not forget the unheard masses for whom the Renaissance brought no respite. Life for most remained an unrelenting trial of subjugation, squalor and suffering, regardless of whether a Michelangelo or Da Vinci wielded their brush. The glittering achievements and breakthroughs of the age were but islands rising from a roiling sea of adversity and anguish. For every Sophonisba who ascended, countless daughters of the Renaissance remained shackled in obscurity, their voices stifled and their talents squandered by the unyielding edicts of their time and station. As we reflect back on this pivotal period in history, it is crucial that we peer past the sublime beauty it bequeathed and recognize the unvarnished realities faced by most who lived through it. The true legacy of the Renaissance lies not just in the wonders it wrought, but in the struggles it failed to alleviate for the less exalted of the era. The life and legacy of Leonardo da Vinci perfectly encapsulates both the brilliance and the contradictions of the Renaissance age. Born out of wedlock to a peasant woman in 1452, Leonardo's artistic talents caught the eye of the renowned Florentine painter and sculptor Andrea del Verrocchio, who took the young prodigy on as an apprentice. It was in Verrocchio's workshop that Leonardo honed his craft and began to develop his distinctive style, blending his mastery of the human form with an almost scientific attention to detail. But while Leonardo's artistic genius was immediately recognized by his contemporaries, he initially struggled to find consistent patronage and support. He bounced between cities and noble courts, taking on commissions when he could get them, but often leaving works unfinished as he chased new opportunities or found himself at odds with his patrons. There's a famous anecdote about Leonardo's time in the court of the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza. The Duke had commissioned Leonardo to create a magnificent bronze horse statue to be the largest equestrian statue in the world at the time. Leonardo threw himself into the project, making countless preparatory sketches and models. But the years dragged on, and the statue was never completed. The 80 tons of bronze that had been set aside for the statue were instead melted down to make cannons to defend the city against invasion by the French. The clay model Leonardo had built was used for target practice by French archers and destroyed. It's a testament to the political instability and warfare that could disrupt even the most ambitious artistic projects of the age. Despite these setbacks, Leonardo's fame only grew. His iconic works like The Last Supper and the Mona Lisa sealed his reputation as one of the foremost artists, not just of the Renaissance, but of all time. And of course, Leonardo's brilliance extended far beyond the canvas. He was a true Renaissance man in every sense. A painter, sculptor, inventor, engineer, scientist, and philosopher who was endlessly curious about the world around him. His notebooks are filled with astonishingly prescient designs and concepts, from flying machines to solar power to scuba gear. In many ways, Leonardo da Vinci stood apart from his age. He was a vegetarian who bought caged animals just to set them free, a habit that was considered deeply eccentric at the time. He was also likely homosexual and was arrested in 1476 with 3 other young men on charges of sodomy. While the charges were ultimately dropped, homosexuality was harshly punished in Renaissance Italy, another reminder of the social strictures and threats of violence that permeated even the most enlightened circles. Leonardo spent his final years in France as a guest of King Francis I, who provided him with a stipend and a manor house near the royal Château d'Amboise. It was a comfortable semi-retirement for the aging master, but he left many of his works and notebooks unfinished when he died in 1519. Legend has it that he breathed his last in the arms of King Francis himself, though that story is likely apocryphal. The life of Leonardo da Vinci shows us that even the towering geniuses of the Renaissance had to contend with many of the same challenges and indignities as the common rabble: inconstant patrons, societal prejudices, the spectre of war and violence looming over even the most ambitious projects. Leonardo was undoubtedly one of the brightest stars of the age, but he didn't shine in isolation. He was shaped by the times he lived in, and occasionally stymied by them despite his undeniable brilliance. As singular a figure as Leonardo was, in some ways, his experience was a microcosm of the greater sweep of the Renaissance itself, a period of astonishing creativity and achievement, but also one in which that potential was constantly checked by the harsh realities and deep injustices of the age. The fact that Leonardo accomplished as much as he did, leaving such an indelible mark on art and on history, is not just a testament to his own genius, but to the indomitable human spirit that endured through even the darkest aspects of life in the Renaissance. While kings, dukes, and popes vied for power and prestige, the common people bore the brunt of their ambitions and follies. The incessant warfare between the Italian city-states and neighbouring powers meant that the countryside was frequently ravaged by marauding armies. Mercenary companies like the Black Bands of Giovanni de' Medici, also known as Giovanni of the Black Bands for his distinctive black mourning attire, were notorious for their brutality. Motivated only by profit, these mercenaries would loot, pillage, and rape with impunity as they moved from one employ to the next. For the peasants who worked the land, this meant the constant threat of having their livelihoods and their lives destroyed at a moment's notice. A farm that had been tended by the same family for generations could be burned to the ground on the whim of a passing condottiero, and there was little recourse for the victims of these depredations. The nobles who employed the mercenaries were more concerned with their own territorial squabbles than the sufferings of the lower classes. Even in times of relative peace, the lot of the peasantry was one of unrelenting hardship. The vast majority were serfs, bound to the land and to the will of their noble landlords. They were required to work the lord's fields, to give up a substantial portion of their crops in taxes and rent, and to submit to the often arbitrary justice of the manor courts. A serf could not marry, move to another village, or take up a trade without their lord's permission. It was a life of backbreaking labour, with little hope of advancement or escape. In the cities, conditions were little better for the working poor. The medieval guild system, which was still largely in place during the Renaissance, strictly controlled entry into the various trades and crafts. Apprenticeships were long, arduous, and often exploitative. An aspiring craftsman could spend years toiling under a master with little pay and no guarantee of eventual membership in the guild. And even those who did become master craftsmen often struggled to make ends meet, as they could be undercut by cheaper goods from the countryside or foreign imports. For women, the opportunities were even more limited. While noble women could wield considerable influence through their marriages and family connections, for the vast majority of women, life revolved around childcare, housework, and helping with the family trade. Girls were typically given little formal education and were often married off as teenagers to men twice their age. The dangers of childbirth meant that many women didn't survive into their 40s. Perhaps no group suffered more during the Renaissance than the Jews. While there had been periods of relative tolerance in medieval Europe, By the 15th century, anti-Semitism was on the rise. Jews were increasingly confined to ghettos, subjected to punitive taxes, and banned from most professions except moneylending, which only fueled resentment. The Spanish Inquisition, which began in 1478, made the persecution of Jews official state policy. Jews were forced to convert to Catholicism or face exile or execution. Many chose to flee, dispersing Sephardic Jewish communities across Europe and the Ottoman Empire. But even those Jews who converted, known as conversos, were never fully accepted into Christian society. They were constantly under suspicion, their sincerity always in doubt. Any hint of adherence to Jewish customs or rituals could lead to an investigation by the Inquisition, with torture and death the potential consequences. The story of the Carvajal family is a poignant example of the impossible position many conversos found themselves in. Luis de Carvajal was a converso who rose to prominence as a royal official in Spain and then Mexico. But his family secretly maintained their Jewish faith, observing the Sabbath and holidays behind closed doors. When Luis's nephew, also named Luis, was caught with a cache of Jewish books and ritual objects, the Inquisition pounced. The entire Carvajal family was arrested, and most would eventually die in prison or at the stake, martyrs to their faith. These stories paint a grim picture, but it's important to remember that even in the face of such oppression and adversity, people found ways to resist, to maintain their humanity, and even to thrive. The Renaissance was a time of incredible cultural ferment, when the rediscovery of classical learning and a new spirit of inquiry led to an explosion of creativity in art, science, and philosophy. But it was also a deeply unequal and often cruel age, where the glories of the era were built on the backs of the downtrodden and dispossessed. As we've journeyed through the Renaissance together tonight, I hope I've given you a sense of both the light and the shadow of this pivotal period in human history. The soaring achievements and the crushing injustices, the brilliant triumphs and the squalid brutalities. It's a complex and contradictory picture, but one that I believe is vital for us to grapple with, because only by confronting the whole truth of our past, in all its beauty and all its ugliness, can we hope to build a better future. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, let your dreams be filled not just with the grand palaces and masterpiece paintings of the Renaissance, but also with the humble cottages and tired faces of the common people who made it all possible. Let us remember them and honor their struggles and their sacrifices. And let us never forget that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit has an incredible capacity for resilience, for compassion, and for hope. Good night. As we've seen, the glittering triumphs of the Renaissance era were built upon a foundation of widespread suffering and hardship for the common people. While a privileged few basked in opulence and patronized the arts and sciences, the vast majority toiled in squalor, superstition, and the ever-present spectre of death. One of the most brutal realities of Renaissance life was the prevalence of gruesome violence and draconian punishments. In an age before police forces or due process, justice was often swift, merciless, and exceedingly cruel. Even minor crimes could result in maiming, torture, or public execution in order to terrorize the populace into submission and obedience to authority. Imagine the scene in a town square on execution day. A festive, almost carnivalesque atmosphere prevails as raucous crowds gather to gawk and jeer at the grim spectacle. Vendors hawk cheap ale and morsels of food to the boisterous mob. The acrid stench of smoke wafts from the smouldering pyres where condemned heretics and witches are being burned alive. Their agonized screams mingle with the clamor of the crowd in a hideous cacophony. At the center stands the executioner, a hooded brute armed with an array of gruesome implements, a blood-encrusted axe, a spiked mace, long iron pincers for tearing flesh. One by one, the the condemned are led up to the platform. A woman accused of adultery has her nose and ears cut off before being whipped senseless. A young pickpocket screams as his hand is chopped off and cauterized with a red-hot iron. A strangled body twists at the end of a rope, feet dancing a ghastly jig. The crowd's bloodlust reaches a crescendo as the main attraction ascends the scaffold, a notorious murderer and rapist. His sentence is to be broken on the wheel, one of the most prolonged and painful forms of execution reserved for the worst malefactors. The man is stripped and lashed spread-eagle to a large wooden wheel. The executioner raises a heavy iron bar and brings it down with a sickening crunch, methodically shattering each bone in the screaming man's limbs, turning him into a mangled wreck. Yet still alive and conscious, he will be woven through the spokes of the wheel and hoisted up on a tall pole, his shattered body left to slowly expire over hours or even days, picked at by crows, his moans a warning to other would-be criminals. Justice has been served. Such stomach-churning brutality was not an occasional occurrence, but a routine part of the Renaissance justice system. Torture was used systematically to extract confessions, especially from those accused of heresy or witchcraft by the Inquisition. Imagine being an ordinary woman, perhaps a midwife or herbalist, who runs afoul of a spiteful neighbor or a fanatical clergyman. An accusation of witchcraft is made, and you are seized from your family and hauled in chains before a grim-faced inquisitor. In a dank torture chamber, you are stripped and subjected to unimaginable agonies, stretched on the rack until your joints pop from their sockets, thumb screws crushing your fingers, your bare feet seared with hot irons. Hour after hour, your interrogator applies the instruments of pain with meticulous cruelty, demanding that you confess to cavorting with Satan, cursing crops, and copulating with demons. Delirious with agony, you will say anything, condemn yourself or even your loved ones, just to make the horrors stop. But your confession has sealed your fate, death at the stake as an unrepentant witch. And so the wheels of Renaissance justice grind on, sparing no one in their path, from the humblest beggar to the highest noble. After all, this was an era where the humane reform was to grant nobility the privilege of execution by beheading rather than the indignities inflicted on commoners. Even for those who escaped the executioner's attentions, violence and brutality were woven into the fabric of daily life during the Renaissance. Rivalries between noble families and city-states, schemes for power and vendettas were often settled at the end of a blade. The infamous House of Borgia, for example, was known for dispatching its enemies via the cantarella, a deadly poison allegedly containing arsenic and ground glass that produced a slow, agonizing death. Lucrezia Borgia was rumored to keep a hollow ring filled with the lethal powder, slipping it into the wine of those who crossed her. Mercenary soldiers and condottieri rampaged across the embattled Italian peninsula, their loyalties going to the highest bidder. Armies like that of Cesare Borgia brought terror and destruction, employing fearsome Swiss pikemen and cutting-edge artillery to crush fortresses and massacre the inhabitants of conquered towns. Machiavelli wrote approvingly of Cesare's brutal tactics in The Prince as a model of decisive action to eliminate one's enemies. The art of killing was elevated to new heights by aristocratic ruffians like the French Baron de Rice, who slaughtered hundreds of peasant children in occult rituals attempting to summon demons. The streets of cities like Verona and Florence rang out nightly with the clash of blades as hot-blooded young nobles battled in the convoluted honor culture of the vendetta. Even the great artist Caravaggio could not escape the violence of the age. His tumultuous life was punctuated by brawls and duels, including killing a man over a tennis bet, leading to his exile and early death. Likewise, the mercurial Benvenuto Cellini, when not crafting exquisite sculptures for the Medici, boasted of vicious murders and beatings dealt out to rivals and enemies. So for all the glories of Renaissance art and invention, violence remained the animating force of the era, as much a part of the fabric of life as Michelangelo's frescoes or Leonardo's flying machines. From the grotesque brutalities of the public execution to the hidden intrigues of the noble courts, the harmony of the spheres dreamed of by Renaissance humanists was always underpinned by the screams of the scaffold. The Spanish Inquisition was a particularly brutal institution during the Renaissance era. Established in 1478 by Queen Isabella I of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon, it was tasked with maintaining Catholic orthodoxy and rooting out heresy, especially among converts from Judaism and Islam. The Inquisition employed a network of spies and informants to identify suspects, who were then arrested and brought before a tribunal for questioning. The interrogations were often little more than a pretext for torture, as confessions extracted under duress were considered valid evidence. The accused rarely had any chance to defend themselves or even know the charges against them. Common torture methods used by inquisitors included the rack, where the victim's limbs would be stretched until their joints dislocated or their bones broke. Another was the strappado, where the prisoner's hands were tied behind their back and they were repeatedly hoisted up and dropped, causing excruciating pain in the shoulders and often permanent damage. Waterboarding, foot roasting, and iron maidens were also used to inflict suffering and terror. Even those who managed to endure the torture and refused to confess were not safe. They could be held indefinitely in the Inquisition's dank, filthy prisons, slowly starving on meagre rations in the darkness. Others were publicly burned at the stake in the auto da fe, or act of faith, where the condemned would be tied to a pole, wood piled at their feet, and set ablaze before a jeering crowd. The stench of charred flesh would hang over the town square for days. One of the most infamous inquisitors of the Spanish Inquisition was Tomás de Torquemada, who served as Grand Inquisitor from 1483 to his death in 1498. A Dominican friar, Torquemada was known for his fanatical devotion to the Catholic faith and his ruthless persecution of those he deemed heretics or apostates. Under Torquemada's leadership, the Spanish Inquisition grew increasingly powerful and far-reaching. Jews, Muslims, and later Protestants were expelled from Spain under threat of death. An estimated 2,000 people were burned at the stake during Torquemada's tenure, with countless more tortured and imprisoned. Even Saint Teresa of Avila, one of the most revered Christian mystics of the era, faced interrogation by the Inquisition for her unconventional religious views. The Spanish Inquisition cast a long shadow of fear and suspicion across Spain that would last for centuries. Families and communities were torn apart by paranoia, as anyone could be accused of heresy based on the flimsiest of evidence or personal grudges. The once vibrant Jewish and Muslim quarters of Spanish cities became ghost towns. Their inhabitants fled or forced to convert. The horrors of the Spanish Inquisition inspired fear and revulsion across Europe, but also grim fascination. Elizabethan playwright Thomas Kyd penned a lurid account of it in his 1592 play, The Spanish Tragedy, full of spies, murder, and madness. Italian philosopher Giordano Bruno, himself executed by the Roman Inquisition in 1600, denounced the crimes and atrocities of the Spanish Inquisition in his writings. But the Spanish Inquisition was not the only institution of religious persecution during the Renaissance. The Roman Inquisition, established in 1542, targeted those deemed heretical to the Catholic Church across the Italian peninsula. And the witch trials that swept through Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries saw thousands, mostly women, tortured and executed for alleged diabolical practices. For example, the Würzburg witch trials in Germany from 1626 to 1631 saw over 400 people burned at the stake, including children as young as 4 years old. The 80-year-old Margaret Prul confessed under torture to having magically castrated a local castellan. He was forced to publicly drop his trousers to display his intact genitalia. The frenzy only ended when the chief prosecutor's wife was herself accused of witchcraft. The Inquisition and the witch trials exemplified the darker impulses of the Renaissance, fueled by superstition, intolerance, and the sinister human potential for cruelty. They served as a grim reminder that for all the glittering achievements of the age's artists and scholars, the lives of ordinary people remained fraught with ignorance, injustice, and the ever-present spectre of a horrific demise. But even those not persecuted for their faith faced daily hardships and indignities during the Renaissance. Certainly, here is the next part of the script for why life sucked even during the Renaissance. Boring history for sleep. As the Italian city-states flourished with trade and banking profits, an elite upper class emerged who reveled in lavish displays of wealth. Perhaps no family exemplified this opulence more than the Medici of Florence. Starting out as humble wool merchants, the Medici built a vast banking empire that stretched across Europe. Under Cosimo de' Medici in the early 15th century, the family became the unofficial rulers of the Florentine Republic, dominating the city's politics and patronizing legendary artists like Brunelleschi, Donatello, and Botticelli. The Medici spared no expense in showcasing their prestige. They constructed magnificent palaces like the Palazzo Medici, filled with priceless tapestries, paintings, and sculptures. Cosimo's grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent, was famous for the extravagant parties he would host, where guests dined on exotic delicacies, sipped fine wines, and were entertained by musicians, acrobats, and poets. Lorenzo himself was known to stroll the streets of Florence in ermine-trimmed robes, as he made his way to intellectual salons to discuss art and philosophy with fellow elites. But the glittering lifestyle of the Medici was a far cry from the lot of the average labourer or peasant in Renaissance Italy. While the bankers counted their gold florins, most people toiled away in back-breaking jobs, barely earning enough to get by. Unskilled workers like construction hands, washerwomen or street sweepers might earn a meagre wage of 8 to 10 soldi per day. Skilled craftsmen like stonemasons or carpenters, while better off, still only took home around 18 to 25 soldi daily, a sum quickly consumed by the costs of rent, food, and clothing for a family. The working poor of Florence lived crammed into squalid tenements, in close quarters that lacked proper sanitation or ventilation. Diseases spread rapidly in such conditions, and outbreaks of the plague frequently ravaged the lower classes, while the wealthy had the means to flee to country estates. During economic downturns or famines, destitute workers might be forced to sell off their furniture, tools, or clothes, or to put their young children to work as servants or apprentices. If they defaulted on debts, they could end up in debtor's prison or be pressed into service as an oarsman on a galley ship, an often deadly assignment. This gaping inequality led to frequent unrest among the lower classes of Florence. In 1378, the city was rocked by the Ciompi revolt, where wool carders and other humble labourers rose up to seize the government and demand greater rights. Although the oligarchs soon re-established control, the turmoil demonstrated the simmering tensions between the haves and have-nots. The Medici themselves faced challenges to their rule and were twice driven from power by rival factions and mobs. But each time, the banking dynasty clawed their way back to the top through a mix of deft political alliances, patronage, and shows of force. As the 15th century drew to a close, the Medici tightened their grip on Florence, abandoning all pretense of republican rule. Political liberty, Lorenzo the Magnificent once declared, is nothing but a name and a delusion. Under his son Piero and grandson Lorenzo II, Medici extravagance reached new heights, with Lorenzo II investing vast sums in failed attempts to become the Pope and even a crusader king. The family fortunes began to teeter under the strain. In 1494, When the French king Charles VIII invaded Italy, the Florentines revolted against Piero the Unfortunate's inept rule and expelled the Medici once again. The fiery preacher Girolamo Savonarola stepped into the void, establishing a theocratic republic and vowing to stamp out vice and excess. Savonarola's followers built the famous bonfire of the vanities, burning cosmetics, artworks and books deemed to be sinful. But the Medici still lurked in the shadows, determined to reclaim what they saw as their birthright. The dizzying rise and fall of the Medici illustrates the precarious nature of wealth and status in Renaissance Italy, where fortunes could be made and lost overnight. Beneath the family's glittering facade lay more than a century of ruthless power struggles, conspiracies and popular unrest. Surrounded by hidden enemies and fair-weather friends, the Medici could trust no one completely. Even at the height of their power and prestige, they lived in constant fear of the social and political forces that might unseat them, as so many leading families before them had been toppled. For the poverty-stricken masses of Florence, however, the schemes and intrigues of the mighty were a distant concern. They remained trapped in a cycle of subsistence labour, forever at the mercy of economic swings, food shortages, and disease. The Medici's splendour was as inaccessible to them as the heavens. In a society so deeply riven by class divisions, most people stood little chance of ever rising above their humble station, no matter how hard they toiled. The poor were viewed as crude, sinful, and hopelessly ignorant, deserving of their lowly lot in life. Of course, this is not to say that the wealthy did not also face dangers in Renaissance Italy. Even the most illustrious bloodlines were not immune to the era's turmoil and instability, as one of the most shocking events of the period would soon demonstrate. In 1476, under the cover of darkness, a band of masked conspirators crept into Florence's cathedral clutching daggers. The Inquisition and religious persecution weighed heavily on the minds of many during the Renaissance. While the Catholic Church experienced a resurgence in influence and power, this often came at the expense of religious minorities and those deemed heretical. Perhaps no institution embodied this oppressive zeal more than the Spanish Inquisition. Established in 1478 by King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile, the Inquisition originally targeted forced converts from Judaism and Islam who were suspected of secretly practicing their old faiths. Known as Marranos and Moriscos respectively, these conversos faced constant suspicion and persecution. Thomas de Torquemada, the first Grand Inquisitor of Spain, was ruthless in his mission to root out heresy. A Dominican friar and the Queen's own confessor, Torquemada used torture, coercion, and public executions to strike fear into the hearts of the populace. His network of spies and informants created a culture of paranoia and distrust. One particularly infamous event was the mass expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492. The same year Columbus sailed for the New World. Known as the Alhambra Decree, it gave Spanish Jews mere months to either convert to Catholicism or leave the country entirely. Many fled to Portugal, North Africa, and the Ottoman Empire. Others converted publicly, but continued to practice Judaism in secret, always afraid of being discovered by the Inquisition. Imagine the fear of the Medina family, forced to leave their home in Toledo and journey to an uncertain future. They pack their meagre belongings onto a cart, the children crying as they bid farewell to the only home they've ever known. Joseph, the father, fingers the silver menorah hidden beneath his cloak, an heirloom passed down for generations. He prays their flight to Portugal will not be in vain. The tentacles of the Inquisition soon spread beyond the Iberian Peninsula. With the advent of the Protestant Reformation, the Church was on high alert for any whiff of dissent. Inquisitions were established in Italy, Portugal, and even the New World colonies to stamp out heresies like Lutheranism and Calvinism. But the Spanish Inquisition was always the most notorious, a dark spectre that cast a long shadow over the Renaissance. Its cruel methods and relentless efficiency became a byword for intolerance. As late as 1826, a Protestant heretic was still being burned at the stake in Valencia. The last official execution of the Inquisition was in 1834, a somber reminder that even in a time of progress and enlightenment, religious persecution remained a grim reality for far too many. Meanwhile, the Renaissance also saw a surge in witch trials and executions across Europe. While belief in witchcraft had existed for centuries, the 1400s to 1600s saw an intense explosion of witch hunts. Historians estimate that around 80,000 suspected witches were tried, and up to 60,000 executed during this period. The accused were often poor, marginal women, the elderly, widows, herbalists, and midwives. They made a convenient scapegoat for any kind of misfortune, from failed crops to sickness. The notorious Malleus Maleficarum, written by German Inquisitor Heinrich Kramer in 1487, helped fuel the hysteria. A literal hammer of witches, it was a lurid manual for identifying, interrogating, and convicting suspected witches. Trial records paint a chilling picture of the injustices these women faced. In the German city of Trier in 1581, an elderly beggar named Eva Teschen was accused of witchcraft. She protested her innocence, but was still subjected to brutal torture and inhuman conditions in prison. Weighted with heavy chains, she languished for months in a dark dungeon cell, given only stale bread and dirty water to subsist on. Eventually, broken in body and spirit, she confessed to being seduced by the devil and was burned at the stake. Her pitiful possessions were confiscated, leaving her 2 children homeless and destitute. Such was the fate of countless innocents swept up in the witch craze. Even esteemed figures like Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, a German magician, alchemist, and occult philosopher, faced accusations of black magic. Though Agrippa had served as a trusted court advisor to Emperor Charles V, he spent his final years hounded by the Inquisition, his books banned and branded as heretical. He died in poverty and obscurity, a cautionary tale of how quickly one's fortunes could turn in such a climate of superstition and paranoia. For while the Renaissance is remembered as a time of awakening and enlightenment, it could not fully shake off the yoke of religious intolerance. The Inquisition and the witch trials remind us that beneath the glittering surface of art and humanism, prejudice and persecution remained woven into the very fabric of society. Progress, as ever, came with a price, paid most heavily by those at the margins. And so we see that even in an age of rebirth, the Renaissance world could still be a dark and unforgiving place for those who dared to dissent from the status quo. As the 16th century progressed, the innovations and cultural achievements of the Renaissance continued to transform Europe. But for the vast majority of people, these developments remained tantalizingly out of reach. While a select few artists and scholars enjoyed the patronage of wealthy nobles, the lives of the working class remained a daily struggle for survival. Take the case of Bartolomeo, a stonemason's apprentice in Florence. From sunup to sundown, he toiled in the workshop, hauling heavy blocks of marble and chiseling intricate designs under the watchful eye of his master. His hands were calloused, and his back ached from the constant labor. But he considered himself lucky to have steady work, meager as the wages were. Many of his friends scraped by on odd jobs or turned to petty crime out of desperation. Bartolomeo's greatest dream was to someday see his own designs adorning the grand palazzos and churches of the city. He spent his precious few moments of free time sketching ideas for sculptures and architectural features. But he knew the odds of rising to the level of a respected artist were slim. Without the right connections or a wealthy patron, his talents would likely go unnoticed and unappreciated. He thought of the great Michelangelo, whose larger-than-life sculptures and frescoes were the talk of Italy. What must it be like, he wondered, to have the freedom to devote oneself fully to the arts, to have your genius recognized and celebrated far and wide? For a humble apprentice like Bartolomeo, such a life seemed as distant and unattainable as the stars. Even the scientific revolution, which was beginning to challenge long-held beliefs and transform people's understanding of the world, seemed to have little impact on the day-to-day realities of the working class. While intellectuals like Galileo Galilei and Francis Bacon were making groundbreaking discoveries, the average person remained steeped in superstition and beholden to the whims of nature. In the countryside, farmers continued to pray for good harvests and fear the wrath of an angry God. They had little understanding of the underlying causes of droughts, floods, and other natural disasters that could wipe out a year's worth of hard work in an instant. Even the educated elite subscribed to astrological beliefs, consulting the stars for guidance on everything from political decisions to medical treatments. Perhaps no one embodied the contradictions of the age better than the controversial French astrologer and physician Nostradamus. Born in 1503 to a wealthy family, Nostradamus initially pursued a conventional path as a doctor, but after losing his wife and children to the plague, he turned to the occult arts for answers. Nostradamus claimed to have the power to predict the future through a combination of astrological calculations and divinely inspired visions. His cryptic, open-ended prophecies, published in a series of almanacs and a massive 942-quatrain work called Les Prophéties, would go on to be interpreted and reinterpreted for centuries. Many dismissed Nostradamus as a charlatan, but he had some powerful admirers, including Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother of France. Nostradamus served as her personal physician and advisor, lending a veneer of respectability to his unconventional beliefs. His enduring fame is a testament to the Renaissance fascination with the occult and the enduring human desire to find meaning and order in an uncertain world. For all the intellectual ferment of the age, the vast majority remained focused on the more immediate concerns of earning a living and holding their families together. Even a relatively prosperous craftsman like Bartolomeo knew that his fortunes could change in an instant. All it would take was an injury, an outbreak of disease, or a downturn in the volatile Florentine economy. This precariousness was even more pronounced for Renaissance women, who enjoyed few legal rights and were utterly dependent on the men in their lives. While a handful of exceptional women, like the poet Vittoria Colonna or the artist Sofonisba Anguissola, managed to make names for themselves, they were the rare exceptions. For most women, the only path to security was through marriage, and even that was no guarantee of stability or happiness. Arranged marriages were the norm among the upper classes, with girls as young as 14 or 15 handed over to husbands they barely knew. Domestic abuse was rampant and tacitly condoned by a patriarchal society that viewed women as little more than property. Lower-class women had even fewer options, with most working alongside their husbands in the fields or in workshops. They also bore the brunt of the era's high rates of maternal and infant mortality. Childbirth was a perilous undertaking in an age before modern obstetrics, and many women died in labour or from postpartum infections. Perhaps it's no surprise, then, that one of the most enduringly popular female figures of the Renaissance was not a queen or a noblewoman, but a humble peasant girl turned soldier and martyr. Born to a poor family in the French countryside, Joan of Arc began having visions of saints and angels as a teenager, exhorting her to help the French defeat the English in the 100 Years' War. Against all odds, Joan convinced the hesitant French king to give her an army, which she led to a series of improbable victories against the English. She quickly became a heroine to the common people, who saw in her a champion of the downtrodden and a symbol of French nationalism. But Joan's meteoric rise was short-lived. Captured by the enemy Burgundians and handed over to the English, she was put on trial for heresy and witchcraft by a hostile ecclesiastical court. Despite her steadfast defense of her actions and her faith, Joan was convicted and sentenced to death. On May 30th, 1431, the 19-year-old was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen, her ashes scattered in the Seine River. Joan's story captured the popular imagination like few others in the Renaissance era. In an age of stark inequality and entrenched social hierarchies, here was a lowly peasant girl who had risen to the heights of power and influence, only to be brought low by the very authorities who should have protected her. For the poor and the powerless, Joan was a symbol of defiance and hope in the face of overwhelming odds. But her legacy also speaks to the limits of what even the most exceptional individuals could achieve in the face of systemic injustice and oppression. For all her bravery and conviction, Joan could not ultimately overcome the deeply entrenched power structures of her time. Her story is a reminder that even in an age of great cultural and intellectual achievement, the harsh realities of life for the vast majority remained unchanged. As the Renaissance gave way to the early modern era, Europe would continue to be rocked by wars, religious upheaval, and social and political unrest. The innovations and discoveries of the age would pave the way for even more dramatic transformations in the centuries to come, from the scientific revolution to the Enlightenment and beyond. But for the stonemason's apprentice Bartolomeo and the countless others like him, the farmers and the labourers, the servants and the beggars, life would go on much as it always had. They would continue to toil and struggle, to love and to mourn, to find moments of joy and solace in a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. It's a reminder that history is not just the story of kings and queens, of artists and intellectuals, but of the ordinary people who lived and died in the shadows of the great events of their time. By understanding their lives and their struggles, we can gain a fuller and more nuanced picture of the complex tapestry of the human experience. And with that, dear viewer, we come to the end of our journey through the Renaissance era. I hope this exploration of the harsh realities of daily life has given you a new appreciation for the challenges and complexities of this pivotal period in human history. As we close out this video, I invite you to pause and reflect on the lives of those long ago Florentines, the stonemasons and the farmers, the wives and the mothers, the dreamers and the fighters. Their stories may be largely lost to history, but their struggles and their triumphs live on in the enduring human spirit that connects us across the centuries. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the gritty underbelly of the Renaissance. If you enjoyed this video, I encourage you to like, subscribe, and share it with your fellow history buffs, or with anyone who could use a little help drifting off to sleep. Until next time, this is your faithful guide to the boring bits of history, signing off. Sweet dreams.